After years struggling to get a break in the music business as a singer, Lee Perry's production of People Funny Boy finally gave him a major success, a major opportunity to grab the reins of the music career he had always dreamed of. This was an opportunity he was not going to let slip away. Welcome to Chapter 3 of my look at the late, great Lee Scratch Perry through some of the records available in my collection. Thanks for joining me, everybody. Lee Perry was anxious to get his latest creation, People Funny Boy, a swipe straight to the head of former employer Joe Gibbs with its lyrics about when you were down and out, I used to help you out. Now that you turned big shot, you don't remember that. But he was initially short of funds to get it pressed to vinyl, had to borrow an advance to do so. The 45 would be a major success, both at home in Jamaica and, importantly, in the burgeoning and very lucrative market overseas in the UK, where it was picked up by Graham Goodall's Dr. Bird Records. This sudden infusion of cash, his first major success after years struggling to get a break in the music industry, would see Lee Perry embark on a prolific series of productions that would carry on for many years to come. But first he had to get his infrastructure in place. In short order, he set up an Upsetter record label, an Upsetter record shop, at 36 Charles Street in downtown Kingston, a premises formerly occupied by his friend Prince Buster. There would be an Upsetter sound system, and he would also for a time sponsor an Upsetter radio program on the local radio station. That was the only way to guarantee airplay on the radio. So he was setting up all this infrastructure to put his productions out on the market, test market response, advertise it. He was also beginning to develop contacts in the UK with the major labels that were releasing Jamaican music there for a growing audience, which was rapidly expanding outside the traditional West Indian communities. He would begin a prolific series of productions that year, spending long hours every week in the studio, often till late at night. He had learned his trade working for Joe Gibbs, working at Whirl Studios. He would continue recording at Whirl primarily, also sometimes at Randy's. Sometimes he would share sessions with fellow up-and-coming producers, particularly Bunny Lee. The two would work so closely together at times that sometimes their productions would overlap, credits would get mixed up, but also Clancy Eccles, 90 the Observer, Rupie Edwards, and others. His Upsetter record shop became something of a social hub with producers and artists hanging out. In the UK, one of his next major hits would be called Tighten Up by a vocal group called The Inspirations. When released in the UK, the credit was changed to The Untouchables. The song Tighten Up would actually give its title to a series of compilations released on Trojan Records, which would emerge as the major entity for releasing Jamaican music in the UK. The Tighten Up series debuted in 1969 with Volume 1, and the very first song on Side 1 is Lee Perry's production of Tighten Up. Here credited to The Untouchables. Really, it's a vocal group called The Inspirations, featuring future solo singer Jimmy London, and released on the iconic Trojan Records label, which would come to emblemize this era of reggae in the UK as it was developing, expanding beyond the West Indian audience to a white audience of working class youths, sometimes called skinheads, and some of Lee Perry's productions in this period would find particular favor on this audience. Importantly, also, People Funny Boy heralded a shift in the beat, the tempo of Jamaican music toward what would soon be called reggae. It's considered one of the earliest songs in the new reggae beat. No one can say for sure which was the first. Bunny Lee, for example, claims his production of Bangarang was the very first. Much of these songs coming out right about the same time, using often the same musicians, the producers rubbing shoulders with each other. Very difficult to say which was the first. Another is Feel the Rhythm by Clancy Eccles, which Lee Perry was involved with. Young Lee Perry there at Whirl Studios and included on Rocksteady Intensified. His People Funny Boy, Whirl Studios, soon to be renamed Dynamic. Lee Perry's productions continuing to gain in popularity in this time. Much of 1968 saw Lee Perry building up his infrastructure, building up his catalog of rhythm tracks that he could then add vocalists to. He was finding particular enthusiasm for instrumentals at this time. As he was spending long hours in the studio, he would sometimes get frustrated working with vocalists. Sometimes they couldn't get the feel of a song, couldn't deliver the goods in the time he wanted it to, so he would gravitate toward instrumentals increasingly as time went on. He's working with a consummate group of professionals called the All-Stars, often featuring Winston Wright on organ, maybe Hux Brown on guitar, Jackie Jackson on bass, Hugh Malcolm on drums. These guys played for many of the top producers at the time. They were professionals who could get the results that the producers wanted. And Lee Perry, unusually for Jamaican music, was something of a hands-on producer, not particularly a musician himself, but he knew what he wanted to achieve, how to convey it to the musicians, as opposed to some of the producers who were strictly financiers, who put up the money for the sessions and left the musicians to get on with the creative work. Lee Perry, a hands-on studio auteur and producer as time went on. The Tighten Up series in the UK would run to many volumes, the covers growing increasingly risque as time went on. This volume 2 included another major hit on the UK market, Return of Django. Lee Perry setting up contacts in the UK with the major labels that were releasing Jamaican music there, Dr. Bird, Palmer Records, and Trojan Records, which set up his own UK-based Upsetter subsidiary label to release his product. In 1969, the year which saw the floodgates truly open as far as Lee Perry's music being released to the public, Lee Perry made the first of many trips to the UK, and in November of that year, he released his debut album. After many years struggling to get a break in the music business, finally got his debut LP release, simply titled The Upsetter, released on Trojan Records in November 1969, the month and year I was born. This featured a cover shot of Lee Perry in London, flanked by a couple of the models often featured on Trojan Records covers of the time. The iconic Trojan Records label. This is a mono copy. Lee Perry, The Upsetter. As the title, the blurb on the back describes him, singer, songwriter, and producer. This featured songs which were often derived from US R&B hits. One song was based off a Jim Reeves song. Lee Perry using any kind of source matter that he could then reinterpret, adapt into a vocal version, an instrumental version. This LP is primarily instrumentals. For the man who had once had ambitions of making it as a singer, he's confined only to the odd spoken intro on here. There are some vocals by one of the singers he was working with. A singer named Busty Brown does a cover of To Love Somebody, as well as the Musketeers, actually vocal group the Silvertones that he was working with. The titles, you see Lee Perry, the pop culture fan, man from MI5, Thunderball, referencing the James Bond films. Night Doctor actually was in Ansel Collins' production, session keyboard player Ansel Collins, which he then licensed that song to Lee Perry, and it featured the first drumming on record of a young musician by the name of Lowell Dunbar, who is nicknamed Sly due to his love of Sly Stone from Sly and the Family Stone. Night Doctor, first drumming on record of Sly Dunbar, drum legend. Lee Perry the Upsetter, looking very dapper in a forest green overcoat here. The infusion of cash coming in from his productions at long last. Lee Perry would indulge himself by getting a Jaguar automobile imported from England, developed a love of fine clothes. He was living the fast life. He was working hard, spending long hours in the studio, but he was playing hard too. And he took advantage of this newfound success to move his growing family with partner Pauline Morrison out of the ghetto into a more modest middle-class neighborhood called Washington Gardens, where they would eventually settle at the address of 5 Cardiff Crescent, a modest house there, which would be their base for many years to come as his family with Pauline expanded in this period. 1969 would see the Clint Eastwood album appear on Trojan rival Palma Records, assembled around the hit song of the title name. Clint Eastwood, the spaghetti western films of director Sergio Leone and others being very popular in Jamaica at this time. Lee Perry was a big fan, and those spaghetti western themes increasingly started to dominate his productions at this time, especially the instrumentals. High Plains Drifter compiles some of his very early recordings in this period, starting in 1968. This is a 2012 compilation from Pressure Sounds. You get Val Blows In with Val Bennett, High Plains Drifter itself by the Upsetters. Lee Perry in this period fully adapting, fully assuming the mantle of the Upsetter. His brand name, his label, his musical identity, his role in life, in music as the upsetter, to upset, to disturb the complacency of those in power, those with the wealth. Increasingly having his business dealings handled in the UK at this time, either through Palma Records, through Trojan Records. Trojan would put together a further LP in 1969 called Return of Django, based on the title track, an instrumental which was a reworking of the Fats Domino R&B hit Sick and Tired. The very dapper Lee Perry there, and his Upsetters band in full Western regalia here. Return of Django, a touchstone song of the emerging skinhead audience in the UK. Was recording an increasing number of instrumentals in this period, often spaghetti western themed or pop culture themed, and he was using the session band known as the All-Stars. For him, he would dub them the Upsetters. They would be known under different names depending on what producer they worked for. Lee Perry, his musical identity, his brand being the Upsetter. Of course, his band had to also be the Upsetters, and most of his albums in this period would be credited to the band rather than him personally. And there would be several LPs a year appearing from here on in of Lee Perry productions. He would continue at a very prolific pace. Some of the vocalists he was working with at this time would be the Versatiles, the Inspirations, aka the Untouchables, who had done Tighten Up, the Silvertones, a singer called Busty Brown, who was very soulful. Another very soul-influenced singer who Lee Perry had something of the idea to groom into a Jamaican James Brown was a singer named David Crooks, who had had an embarrassing failure a few years before trying to record for Duke Reed. He froze at the microphone, couldn't perform, One day, Lee Perry rolled up in his green Jaguar to the studio. He was trying to record a song with his singer, Busty Brown. Busty Brown could not get the feel of the song, so Lee Perry gave up in frustration until a friend of his, Glenn Brown, suggested David Crooks give it a try. Dave Crooks stepped up to the microphone, nailed the song in one take, and it turned out to be a hit. It was called Prisoner of Love. Lee Perry was ecstatic. He would continue working with David Crooks off and on for quite some time to come. David Crooks, Scratch would rename him Dave Barker. He did not like the sound of the last name Crooks. Lee Perry often renaming his artists. For Lee Perry, Dave Barker, as he was now renamed, would often do very soul-inspired vocals like Prisoner of Love, which would lead to a debut LP by Dave Barker, Lee Perry's first single artist release when put out by Trojan Records. This is a music on vinyl reissue. Facsimile Upsetter label there, mimicking the orange and white of the Trojan Records label in the UK. Dave Barker's Prisoner of Love, something of a mixed bag. Dave Barker felt there was better material of his that was left off in the LP, but Dave Barker also had a sideline of doing DJing, American-style jive talk interjections, which was increasingly becoming successful. He did some of that for Lee Perry, doing a song called Shocks of Mighty. He would also go over and be very successful with Duke Reed doing the same thing, with Winston Riley, where he hit with Double Barrel with Dave and Ansel Collins, it was credited to. Big hit on the UK market, the skinhead market, which Lee Perry's productions were increasingly finding favor in. In this period, Lee Perry met two young singers that would factor in his life in years to come. A young baritone singer by the name of Derek Burnett, who is nicknamed Watty. Watty Burnett had a young friend named Mervyn Smith. These two men would factor in Lee Perry's life down the line. But he was increasingly becoming fascinated with instrumentals, which he could churn out very quickly using the session band known as the All-Stars, aka the Upsetters. But he was beginning to get a bit bored using the same musicians all the other producers were using. He wanted a sound that was more uniquely his, that he could sculpt into the sound he wanted to hear, that he could hear in his head, choppier, more aggressive, rawer sound, which he wanted to steer the young style of Jamaican music now known as reggae into. To this end, he fell upon or discovered an up-and-coming session band known as the Hippie Boys. The Hippie Boys had something of a convoluted history, but they had settled on a four-person lineup of Glenn Adams on organ, Alva Reggie Lewis on guitar, and a young rhythm section, two brothers by the name of Aston Barrett on bass and Carlton Barrett on drums. Aston Barrett, then in his late teens, already nicknamed Family Man due to the amount of children he had fathered. This band, the Hippie Boys, Lee Perry would start to groom as something of a B team of upsetters, a secret weapon, if you will. They had recorded a few hit songs to date that had struck solidly on the UK market. They had done an LP for producer Sonia Pottinger called Reggae with the Hippie Boys, but they hadn't been too prolifically recorded to this date. In the winter of 1969, Lee Perry would set out on a tour of the UK with the Upsetters in tow to capitalize on the success of the hit song Return of Django. But with him, he didn't bring the musicians who had actually played on Return of Django. He brought the Hippie Boys as the new Upsetters. Due to Scratch's busy schedule at this time, many projects on the go, many business deals to attend to, he ended up having to go back to Jamaica, leaving the band stranded in England for a time. They would actually record an album called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, continuing with the spaghetti western theme. Credited as the Upsetters, actually had nothing to do with Lee Perry. He was not involved in those sessions. When he heard about it, he was incensed and responded with his own Jamaican version of the album using the same title, but a completely different set of tracks. Reissued by Hot Milk Records a few years ago, the upsetters, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Instrumentals, one DJ vocal on here, I believe. Seeing Scratch experimenting with some of his rhythm tracks, using different combinations. Again, heavily favoring the organ in these early instrumental tracks, often featuring Winston Wright's organ in lead, but bringing in steel drums, kind of unusual in reggae, and some rhythm tracks which would be very familiar in the next phase of Jamaican music. So Lee Perry, very successful in the years 1968 going into early 1970. If he had never produced another record after this, he would probably be well remembered, well thought of by reggae music collectors, by fans of that particular era, but he might not have been too well known internationally. However, events were coming around the corner, events were transpiring which would see the name of Lee Scratch Perry, the Upsetter, written large in the history book, as what would happen next would have seismic repercussions on the world of Jamaican music and the world at large in general. Thanks for tuning in. Stay tuned for the next installment of my look at Lee Perry, the Upsetter, in Chapter 4. Thanks for tuning in, everybody.